If you follow my Facebook page, you'll see that I fly a lot. It's just part of the job. In fact, I've always flown a lot. It's been part of several jobs that I've had over time. And as a frequent flyer, like I imagine a lot of you, have become familiar with this sort of necessary inconvenience that we call airport security. Recent surveys show that going through security at an airport averages only 15 to 30 minutes, but it can be up to 45 minutes to an hour during peak times. People have differing attitudes about airport security. I don't know. I guess I'm just kind of used to it. But you might not know that it wasn't always that way. When Frank Sinatra made flying seem cool in his 1957 Come Fly With Me, you could pretty much hop on an airplane with nary a check. The airport security that we have today has evolved a lot with time, but security, pretty much like we're used to it, really didn't begin until January 5th, 1973. It's history that deserves to be remembered.
January 5th, 1973 might have been 53 years ago, but it still seems rather late in the commercial aviation game to have started paying attention to who was boarding an airplane with what. Christopher Mother observed in a September 25, 2021 edition of the Boston Globe. Those who flew on an airplane before 1973 might remember. For the rest of us, it sounds surreal, almost unfathomable. Airport security was non-existent. Commercial aviation dates back at least to 1914 with the establishment of the St. Petersburg to Tampa airboat line, often cited as the first scheduled airline. Commercial aviation grew substantially over the next 6 decades. The Friends of Alfred Whitted Airport in St. Petersburg, Florida, note that the airboat line operated for 4 months and carried a total of around 1,200 passengers. According to a 1961 publication of the Air Transport Association, the U.S. scheduled airline industry carried 57,709,000 passengers in 1960, up from 1,864,000 in 1939. And yet, even in 1960, boarding an airliner was essentially no more complicated than boarding a bus. No ID was required, just a ticket, which often wasn't checked until you were boarding the plane. That's not to say that there weren't concerns. Various acts of violence and what today would be called hijackings occurred in the early days of aviation, but there was little government response. But that started to change. On November 1st, 1955, United Airlines Flight 629, a Douglas DC-6B, exploded in midair over Weld County, Colorado, killing 39 passengers and 5 crew. The shocking result of the resulting investigation was that a man named John Gilbert Graham had placed dynamite in his mother's baggage in order to claim a life insurance policy. As shocking as the crime was, perhaps as startling was how easy it was to place a bag of dynamite on an aircraft. Graham was charged and convicted of murder, as there was, at the time, no specific law against placing a bomb on an airplane. In 1956, Congress modified Title 18 of the Criminal Code to make destruction of aircraft or aircraft facilities a federal offense. On August 23, 1958, President Eisenhower signed the Federal Aviation Act, which centralized federal responsibilities over aviation into a new independent federal aviation agency, responsible for civil aviation safety. While the agency was tasked with the safe and efficient use of national airspace, the initial task was to regulate air routes and traffic control. But the website of the Federal Aviation Administration explains, almost from its creation, the agency found itself faced with a number of unexpected challenges. In 1961, for example, the first series of aircraft hijackings in the U.S. occurred. That first act was committed by 35-year-old Antulio Ramirez Ortiz, a Miami electrician who had boarded National Airlines Flight 337 from Key West to Miami, Florida, with a gun and a knife, and demanded that the plane be flown to Havana, Cuba. Ortiz reportedly told the pilots that he had been approached to kill Fidel Castro and wanted to travel to Cuba to warn him. The Puerto Rican-born Ortiz called himself El Pirata Confrezi, using the name of a famous Puerto Rican pirate of the 19th century, because don't all good stories involve pirates? The plane was allowed to land in Havana. FAA historian Terry Krause explains, after some 2 hours in Havana, May 2, 1961, all passengers except Ortiz returned to the United States. Hijacking an aircraft was not yet a federal crime, and the New York Times, not knowing what to call the hijacking, referred to the incident as a forced detour. With no statute covering hijacking, Ortiz was indicted by a federal grand jury for assault, transporting a kidnapped person, and transportation of a stolen vehicle, although Ortiz would not face charges until he attempted to return to the United States 14 years later. While that was the first event to take place in U.S. airspace, the New York Times noted that year that at least 7 Cuban planes in the last 2 years had been commandeered and flown into the United States. The trend that Ortiz started was to go the other direction. And trend it was. On July 24th, an Eastern Airlines flight was hijacked over Florida to Cuba. On July 31st, another attempt was made against a Pacific Airline flight, although the hijacker was overpowered by other passengers and crew before the plane could take off. Another attempt to hijack a plane to Cuba, this time a Continental Airlines 707, was thwarted when the president ordered that the tire of the plane be shot out before it could take off. A Pan American flight was successfully hijacked to Cuba on August 9th. The federal government took what actions it could. In an August 10, 1961 press conference, President Kennedy announced, "We are also going to insist that every airplane lock its door, and that the door be strong enough to prevent entrance by force, and that the possession of the key be held by those inside the cabin, so that pressure cannot be put on the members of the crew outside to have the door opened." More substantially, the president announced that he had ordered on a number of our planes a border patrolman who will ride on a number of our flights. On September 5, 1961, Congress amended the Federal Aviation Act to include the crime of air piracy. The new statute made the crime punishable by death. But these new laws didn't stop the practice. Writing in a 1986 edition of the American Journal of Sociology, statistician Robert T. Holden of the University of Indiana noted that between 1968 and 1972, there were 326 hijacking attempts worldwide, or one every 5.6 days. These included 137 attempts by individuals who boarded flights in the United States, or one such attempt every 13.3 days. In 2018, Robert McCree of John Jay College of Criminal Justice wrote in the Journal of Applied Security Research that the drill in the cockpit to take the skyjacker to Havana was so well known that pilots were advised to cooperate with armed interlopers, fly them to the Caribbean Isle, let passengers obtain their ceremonial box of cigars and some rum, and then continue on to the original intended destination with as little further interruption as possible. Clearly something needed to be done. But what? David J. Haas, a former engineer at Philips Electronic Instruments, wrote in Smithsonian Magazine in 2021, "It seemed as if no one had any idea how to stop airline passenger hijackings. Not federal law enforcement agencies, the military, professional security people, absolutely no one. This represented a serious problem worldwide." A July UPI report quoted FAA official Irving Rips. "It's an impossible problem short of searching every passenger. If you've got a man aboard that wants to go to Havana and he has a gun, that's all he needs." The report notes that these hijackings were a concern for the State Department as they give Castro an opportunity to create a crisis anytime another plane lands. He need merely hold the passengers hostage. Mississippi Senator James Eastland opined that, "I don't think that any laws that Congress might pass would help." McKee notes that there was even a tongue-in-cheek suggestion to build a replica Havana airport in Miami to trick hijackers, something that the FAA Administrator John Schaefer pointed out would work once, and that's all. The UPI report concludes that the question of how to prevent airline hijackings is left where nobody wants it, up in the air. It was not simply a United States problem. With international concern growing, on December 16, 1970, an international convention for the suppression of unlawful seizure of aircraft was signed at The Hague, in which signatory nations pledged to return hijacked planes and the people aboard and to assist where possible in prosecuting the hijacker. The convention expanded a 1963 agreement and was later strengthened by a further agreement in 1971. But these conventions did not themselves offer a solution. The FAA began taking additional steps. Among them was a hijacker psychological profile. Kelly Hagen of airline consulting company H4 Solutions explains, "Used by airline ticket agents, the profile asked them to assess whether passengers were exhibiting odd behavior, such as a lack of eye contact or little concern for their luggage. Air travelers believed by ticket agents to indeed be behaving oddly would then be subject to additional screening. The FAA strengthened their program of having armed marshals on some flights, creating the Customs Air Security Officers Program. As a further protection, an explosive detection canine team program was established. But these solutions were simply incomplete. Airline analyst Henry Hardevelt told the Boston Globe in 2021, "You could bring anything on the airplane that you wanted, as long as it fit into your carry-on bag." There were solutions available. Haas notes that a Delaware company called Friskum created a walk-through metal detector based on one that was used in prisons. The machine, however, got little interest. Haas writes, by the end of 1968, Eastern Airlines had purchased a Friskum for its Gate 14 at Washington National Airport, where they used it occasionally for their flights to Miami. The issue, Mother writes, the bottom line was that no security was in place because no one wanted to pay for it. But hijackings became more dangerous and deadly. On June 11, 1971, 23-year-old Gregory White of Chicago walked by security at O'Hare International Airport and attempted to board a TWA 727. When the flight attendant asked for his boarding pass, he drew a pistol. He ordered the passengers off, but when one passenger tried to go back for a forgotten item, he was fatally shot. White was demanding to be flown to North Korea. The pilots, however, had been able to contact flight operations, and an armed deputy U.S. Marshal was able to enter the cockpit through a window. White was wounded in a shootout with a marshal and arrested. Another high-profile case in 1971, the November 24th hijacking of Northwest Airlines Flight 305 by a man using the alias D.B. Cooper, in which he successfully jumped from the airplane with $200,000 in ransom money, kept attention on the problem. Meanwhile, Haas notes that Philips had created a low-dose X-ray scanner that could see inside a bag without the need of a dangerous amount of radiation. The machine was called Safe Ray and became available in 1970. Haas writes, no recognition was ever given to Philips engineers George W. Shepard Jr. or Neil Diapivan for their invention. It is sad that neither the United States federal government, the Transportation Security Administration, nor any other aviation organization ever recognized them. The fundamentals of airport security as we recognize it today were available, but history professor Janet Bednarik of Dayton University told the Globe, the big debate was who was going to be responsible for security. Was it going to be the federal government or the airlines? Congress decided on the airlines. Bednarik notes, there were calls for a federal airport security division, but Congress decided not to fund it. Instead, on ironically, September 11, 1972, the FAA announced that under Department of Transportation auspices, the use of electronic and other surveillance techniques by U.S. flag carriers to all gateway airports in the U.S. and in other countries wherever possible. The rule became effective January 5, 1973, and began airport security, at least somewhat like we'd recognize it today. While some airlines did security at the gate, it required less manpower to have only a few checkpoints that could screen for multiple flights, the beginning of screening stations. And it predictably created issues. The New York Times reported on January 6, 1973, United States Airlines began yesterday in the most widespread program of personal searches in the nation's history to inspect every item carried onto their 14,000 daily flights and to scan all their 500,000 daily passengers with electronic weapons detectors. The public was unfamiliar with the rules. The Times notes that in a random check by a reporter at LaGuardia Airport, almost half the passengers were carrying enough metal to trigger the alarm. Although the paper notes, for the most part, they were introduced smoothly, and many passengers said they had no objections. Passengers were warned to arrive 15 to 30 minutes earlier than usual, a warning with which a traveler today would be familiar. The Times notes several instances where alarms were set off by things like arch support in shoes, glasses, or pocket change, and an instance in Buffalo where one was activated by shrapnel in the body of a World War II veteran. Airlines found ways to make the process less onerous. The Times reports, at Los Angeles International Airport, 22 young women outfitted in miniskirts were hired by American Airlines to examine bags and search passengers, drawing praise from many male travelers. Hagen notes that, of course, airport security checkpoints and the screening practices occurring at them would gradually become more comprehensive in the decades following 1973, including into the 21st century. Eventually, checked baggage also was subjected to screening as well. But the screening was still incomplete. Hagens writes, private security companies and their employees, who often were underpaid and overworked, were still staffing those checkpoints under contract from airlines at airports. Hartevelt explains of the system, it was designed to tell hijackers we're going to make it difficult for you to hijack a plane, but it was never a system that would make hijacking impossible. Notably, unlike today, a person could go through security without a ticket to drop off or meet friends at the gate. ID was not required, and Hartevelt notes, the thought of anyone trying to do something like 9/11 was clearly never considered.
On November 19, 2001, Congress passed the Aviation and Transportation Security Act and moved airline security away from these private contractors and airlines to the newly created Transportation Security Administration. And the system is, of course, stricter now, which also results in more complaints. There are still flaws in the system. Everett Rogers, in his seminal work Diffusion of Innovations, uses airline hijackings as an example of adaptive innovation. He essentially argues a hijacker will hijack a plane, government will see how he does it and come up with ways to prevent that, and the hijacker will see what government does and come up with new ways to get around that security. This sort of adaptive innovation makes it a very difficult problem for the FAA to solve, and all of that suggests that transportation security and risk will continue to evolve, and that we as passengers can expect to continue to stand in line well into the future. I hope you enjoyed watching this episode of The History Guy, and if you did, please feel free to like and subscribe and share The History Guy with your friends. And if you also believe that history deserves to be remembered, then you can support The History Guy as a member on YouTube, a supporter on our community at Locals, or as a patron on Patreon. You can also check out our great merchandise shop or book a special message from The History Guy on Cameo.